Greetings, friends and countrymen. Welcome to Conspiracy Corner News, episode 21. This is Bart Zabrell. Conspiracy Corner News briefly highlights the week's most significant and underreported news events throughout the world, focusing on special preparation for the difficult times ahead for all mankind. To help support the dozens of hours of research required each week to produce Conspiracy Corner, would you please be so kind as to consider making a regular PayPal donation of just $5 each month? I know last time I said $1, but PayPal took a third of it, so it's about as much as a nice cup of coffee. So what about $5? It's my favorite currency. Anyway, Lincoln's a good president, allegedly, because the whole conspiracy behind that one, but we'll skip that. Simply click on Bart Zabrell here below the video, which takes you to my YouTube homepage. Oh, looks like I'm going to have to widen the screen here. Click on the donate button. Then click on this thing that says make this reoccurring monthly. Type in $5. And then you go down and log in with your PayPal account or pay with a debit or credit card if you prefer. This way, Conspiracy Corner News is completely user supported, and this is done so in the most painless and simple way possible. Your thoughtfulness is most appreciated. For example, on this particular week's article, which I write for the Sleuth Journal, I spent 14 hours writing the article, exhausting nonstop. And to prepare the video portion of it and the slides and everything like that takes several more hours. So it's about 2 days out of a 5-day work week volunteering. So if you think it's worth $5 a month, which is, what is that, about $1.25 an episode, it would be greatly appreciated. That helps me take off from other tasks to do this effort here as a volunteer. So let's get on with what we're going to talk about today. This is an Apollo update. Most of you know me or came to know me because of the Apollo moon conspiracy, which is not a theory, it's a fact if you've seen the movie and the footage uncovered, and if we get into the details today of newly discovered evidence. I was well known for producing the film A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, as well as Astronauts Gone Wild with the infamous punch I received from Buzz Aldrin. What I want to talk about, and kind of lead up to it, is this newly discovered document from 1958 that basically scientifically states from a high-ranking NASA scientist that there's a particular circumstance that basically shows that the moon missions could not have happened, did not happen in 1969 through 72, and still cannot happen today. But here are the points I wanted to make. Charles Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic in 1927. And aircraft was pretty new back then. Another interesting point here is he's a Mason. We could go into that, couldn't we? 32nd degree. Ooh, look at that. And here's the newspaper. If you're into the Masons and all the Illuminati stuff, they're always into the number 33. Oh, look at this. He traveled from New York to Paris in 33 and a half hours. He was the first person to fly solo, not across the Atlantic, but specifically from New York to Paris as part of a contest, and that's how he became famous. Now, if you add 60 years to 1927, you come up with 1987. And you can guess during that 60 years, there has been a lot of technological progress. For example, when he first flew across the Atlantic, though he had a single-wing aircraft, this is kind of the most advanced aircraft at the time of 1927. A lot of them used biplanes because the engines were fairly slow and they needed the extra lift. And then within 60 years, we have, in fact, they're only 50 years, but 60 years later, we had the 747s. Now, I don't know if you've ever been in one. I have. It's just humongous. It's like 3 or 4 two-story houses, and the volume contained therein getting off of the ground. I have a brother-in-law who works for Boeing designing landing gear for the 747, or at least he used to, and he says he can't even understand how the thing gets off the ground. In fact, interesting side note about Apollo, the Apollo missions, which were the most complicated flight in the entire history of aviation, were also the only first tried aerodynamic craft in the entire history of aviation that worked on the very first occasion. So not only is it the most complicated mission ever attempted, the lunar module had never been flown, and it worked completely perfectly. That has never happened before in the entire history of aviation. From, the first Wright brothers flight, they took them several attempts to get off the ground until today. In fact, the 747 took nearly 2 years longer to develop, with 10 years more advanced technology than the Apollo rocket, which took about 8 years to develop in the 1960s. This took another 2 years to develop, with mostly 70s technology, and when they rolled it out, it could not lift off the ground. They, I believe, went through 162 engines just to get the thing off the ground. Now, by this time, millions of aircraft had been built and flown before, and yet it still took them 162 attempts to get the thing to work. So how is it that a decade earlier than this, going, to another planet basically worked on the first occasion? We can talk about that. Now, basically what I want to point out is, if I said to you that in 1927, Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic, and 60 years later, in 1987, no one had repeated his accomplishment in 60 years, 6 decades more of technological advancement. Would that be logical? Of course not, because we went from the biplanes to the 747s. Now, this is the same thing that Uncle Sam wants you to believe in regard to the moon missions. They want you to believe, and it's just as absurd as what I just said. It's as absurd as saying Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic in 1927, and 60 years later, no one is able to repeat the event with all the advancements in sciences and technology. The federal government would have us believe that they went to the moon on the very first attempt with 1960s technology, and the earliest anyone is slated to, quote, return to the moon is 6 decades later. If it doesn't make sense with Lindbergh, it doesn't make sense going to the moon. We know that technology does not go backwards. In fact, every year things are produced exponentially faster and more efficiently and cheaper than the year before. So just as absurd it is to say that, 60 years later, no one had yet flown across the Atlantic. Obviously, they've gone way past that. To say that 60 years later, no one on Earth, including the nation that claimed to have done it first, can repeat the event is pretty strange. Now, here in the 21st century, NASA has, and the military and some private space contractors have had at least a dozen catastrophic failures in the last 16 years, simply trying to put a payload into Earth orbit. The moon is 1,000 times farther than the general Earth orbit that most people do, which is about 250 miles. Now, if you had a globe, generally one of those 1-foot globes, you can, we'll look at this NASA here as the globe. It would be basically equivalent to a half an inch above the globe. That is as high as the space shuttle flies. Simply 1/2 an inch above the globe. In fact, you can see a picture here that, the land is pretty visible and quite detailed underneath it because it's only 250 miles up. Now, you can just pick any destination, from you that's 250 miles away, which is about 350 kilometers, and realize that that's as far as the most advanced manned spacecraft can do today. And yet they claimed to have gone 1,000 times farther with 1960s technology. One thing that's kind of interesting that someone pointed out to me, the lunar module that allegedly left manned from the lunar surface and synchronized with the command module orbiting the moon at 4,000 miles per hour, if they were off in trajectory or timing by like 1/10 of 1 second, they would have missed each other, wasted fuel, and everyone would have died. And a Walmart watch that you can buy for $10 has more computing power than the entire Apollo program did, all the spacecraft in the command center. So to say that they were able to pull this off, coming up on 50 years ago and cannot repeat it, according to them, for another 10 years with 1960s technology, but it cannot be done today, that's really, one of the things to consider. Here's one of the reports about the NASA's failures. It's talking about how NASA themselves, who, went to the moon in the 60s, somehow still can't put things into Earth orbit without them blowing up. Now, most people are not aware, they don't really think about outer space or the details about cosmic radiation or things like that, but the Earth is surrounded by a radiation field. Now, the radiation field is caused because the Earth's core is iron, which creates a magnetic field. The magnetic field traps solar and galactic radiation around it, and it has been there since the creation of the Earth, however long you believe that to be. So, as you can see, it's these very thick layers of radiation that surround the Earth. Now, one thing to point out, I'm going to try to find this still here, is that every manned mission in the entire history of flight, from the United States, China, the Soviet Union, they all have been right at about here, at about 200 to 250 miles below the beginning of the radiation, and it starts at about 1,000 miles up, and it extends, now they believe, about 30,000 miles thick. The only time humans are said to have gone through this brick wall of radiation is to the moon. They'd have to go through it to reach the moon. And that's what these new papers that are uncovered from 1958 will reveal. Now, the Van Allen belts were discovered by a gentleman by the name of Van Allen. Let me find his picture here. He's so humble to name the radiation belts after himself. And they sent up probes in 1958 that had Geiger counters on them. Geiger counter is a method of registering radioactive particles, and it actually has I guess you call it a sample of radioactive particle in there to use as kind of a guidepost. Generally, these little boxes contain uranium in them. So if you find one at a garage sale, I wouldn't take it home. It might be radioactive. So in any case, they put these Geiger counters on these probes and sent them into the Van Allen radiation belt. And this was done in 1958. And the Geiger counters, I think on one probe, broke because they were fluctuating at such an excessive amount beyond what they anticipated, and they sent up other probes and they wrote down these particular readings. Now, this is something, I guess I'm kind of compelled to go a little bit ahead out of sequence here. Van Allen basically said this. I'm going to read his quote from these probes. I'm going a little out of sequence here, but let me find my paperwork here. Of course, you can read the article in the link of the description of this YouTube video. He said, "Our measurements show that the maximum radiation level is between 10 and 100 rentgens per hour." I think that's another name for REM. Since a human being exposed to 2 days only of 10 rentgens would only have a 50% chance of survival, the radiation belts obviously present an obstacle to spaceflight beyond Earth orbit. Rockets will need to take off from the radiation-free zones at the north or south poles in order to reach the moon. And if we go back to this little picture here, you can see that the radiation belts are kind of like a donut shape. So if there's an opening here without radiation and there's an opening down here, if you were able to somehow launch from the North Pole or the South Pole, you could miss the radiation. That's what he's saying you would have to do. The Apollo astronauts did not do that. They launched from Florida, near the equator, which helps them put them in a better orbit. Additionally, you may remember, I think it was the Challenger. I think that was the first space shuttle that blew up on launch. It did so because it got down to like 43 degrees the previous night. So you can imagine the impossibility of putting sensitive rocket equipment and all those gaskets and things and trying to do that, in 0 degrees or below zero from the North and South Pole. It's just, an infeasible concept to do. Now, when the space shuttle went to its highest altitude ever, this was in 1997, they went up to 380 miles. Their safety equipment started having their alarms go off because they were, I think they were working on retrieving the out-of-focus lens of the Hubble Space Telescope, which is kind of interesting. 20 years after going 1,000 times farther than the space shuttle, with 20 years older technology, they can't even put a telescope into orbit that has a lens that focuses. Oops, the lens doesn't focus. So it kind of shows you, not that necessarily they're inept, but this stuff is extremely difficult. So if it's difficult just to do things into Earth orbit, blowing up 2 space shuttles, blowing up a dozen things in the last 16 years, putting up telescopes that can't even focus, it shows you the absurdity of saying with 20 years older technology than the space shuttle, they went 1,000 times farther than the space shuttle. But when they went up to 380 miles, they found that the radiation level was dangerous. And because of that, they never went to that altitude again. Now at 380 miles, that's 620 miles away from just the beginning of the Van Allen radiation belt. So you have to understand there's this radiation that is so severe that alarms start going off telling you you're approaching dangerous radiation from a distance of 620 miles away. CNN caught the story and they said this, word for word: the radiation belts surrounding Earth are more dangerous than previously believed. Now you have to understand, what does that mean? More dangerous than previously believed. Previous believed meaning the knowledge gathered by the Apollo missions, as they were the only crews who have ever claimed to have gone through the radiation belts. So the question is, how can a space shuttle crew 620 miles away from the beginning of the radiation belt know more about it than the Apollo astronauts who were allegedly in the middle of the belts 18 times to the moon and back for a total of at least 24 hours. You see, it's not possible. You see, it contradicts itself. Again, CNN reports that the space shuttle crew said that the radiation belts are more dangerous than previously believed because when they got to about 130 miles higher than the space station, which is about 380 miles, they found it still too dangerous of a height. Because of the radiation, they descended to a lower altitude. More dangerous than previously believed, and the most knowledgeable people about the radiation belts have to be the Apollo astronauts who went through it. 9 times orbiting the moon and 9 times back, a total of 18 times in it for more than an hour each way, totaling at least 24 hours. So how can the shuttle crew be making discoveries about the radiation belts from 620 miles away that the Apollo astronauts did not make when they were in the middle of them? That itself is, indirect, a little bit, evidence that the Apollo astronauts did not go through the belts. Otherwise, this would not be a new discovery to the space shuttle crew, even when they're, just approaching the belts. Now, in my film, a funny thing happened on the way to the moon. Here's our little logo on the cover. I guess I should have pulled out a picture of the DVD, but this is on the DVD cover. The footage that I uncovered, and this is what really convinced me that the moon landings were fake, is that I was kind of doing the film under the theory that it might be true that they did not go and stage it as kind of a bluff and poker. 3.5 years into the 5-year project, The film cost $500,000, largely because of research and documentation that we bought from, people and the ex-military people and widows of astronauts and things like that. Some documents cost $10,000 each. I said, well, they probably went to the moon. I'm going to give them the benefit of the doubt. And then I found a mislabeled tape. What was on the tape and on the label were two different things. The late Bill Casey believes a source at NASA gave that to me deliberately. I'm beginning to think that that was the case. And in that footage, which has a warning here, I specifically asked NASA for unedited footage. And every single thing I got was edited except this and one other reel, which I have yet to show to anybody. Oops, maybe I shouldn't have said that. Oh, well. And some of my detractors say that this footage that I uncovered is widely available. And that's just simply not the case. Because it says so right here at the beginning of it, this is not for general public distribution. This is an unedited reel. Now, in the reel, they only aired maybe 20, 30 seconds of it, and what the TV viewer saw was what they had claimed was a picture of the Earth floating in space from some great distance away. In fact, I should have done one other shot here if you can ignore this part here. There was one shot that was kind of proportioned to this to show that, there's some great distance away from the Earth. Now, they were allegedly zooming in the camera, the lens, on this here, but there were other shots. If you take out this, outtake there, it looked about this, size to kind of show, hey, look, here we are halfway to the moon, as they claimed they were at the beginning of the footage. And the way they got this footage, as explained to the viewers, is that Neil Armstrong said on this unedited tape, they only had one window that faced the Earth, and it was completely filled up with the TV camera, meaning the TV cameras back then were kind of big, it's bulky. In order to get this shot, or this proportion here of the Earth allegedly floating in space, although that's an outtake because that shows you how they're faking it, which I'll get to in a minute, that they would have to put the lens to the window's glass in order to shoot the Earth far away. And Neil Armstrong says we're calling in from 130,000 miles out. In fact, right before he says he's calling in from 130,000 miles out, he asks NASA, how far out do you have us? Well, he's got the most advanced computer on the entire planet. He knows exactly how far he is away from Earth. His display says it. So why did he ask NASA to tell him how far out he is? Because his display actually says about 250 miles. He's in low Earth orbit. They never left Earth orbit because of the radiation belts. And NASA was running a simulation program, after which one of the controllers said they could tell no difference between an actual flight and a simulation on the computers. So just as they had fake pictures of them on the moon, they had fake data. After all, all it is a computer screen with numbers on it. And if they say the temperature of Saturn is, 15 degrees, then it must be 15 degrees because there it says so on the computer screen. And so what they had is these programs that they rehearsed the moon landings, and it would tell them how far the spacecraft is away, they're approaching the moon, the altitude above the moon, and their descending altitude. All of this was simply based on clock time of a scenario, and Neil Armstrong did not want to contradict the NASA program. That's why he asked, how far out do you have us? And he just parroted it back to them. Now, what this really is a circular window of the spacecraft. They have actually, this is the real location of the camera. This is with the lens zoomed out, and this is a part they didn't intend to show, but if you can imagine, this person's arm is not in front of the window. Sorry, I didn't have this picture prepared, but basically you'd have a circle Earth with black all around it. They're trying to convince you, you see, they're halfway to the moon. Now, halfway to the moon would be completely on the other side of the radiation belts, which NASA just admitted in 1997 that the space shuttle crew, 620 miles away from it, knows more about it than the Apollo astronauts who allegedly went through it. The only way that's possible is if they did not go through it. The camera is actually in the back of the spacecraft, and they've turned out all the lights and blocked sunlight from entering the window, so the foreground is pitch black. What's over here is the panels of the inside of the spacecraft in Earth orbit. This is either a section of the Earth outside of the window, or a colleague of mine, David Percy in England, he believes they used a transparency, kind of like a positive slide, and stuck it over the window and had it backlit by Earthshine. I'm not sure which it is, but I've never seen cloud patterns go completely across the Earth in any satellite picture I've ever seen. So it looks like the proportion is off here. They had a little crescent piece of black material which they inserted here, and that made it look like the Terminator line between night and day. Now here's an outtake when one of the astronauts' arms gets in front of the window. Now again, the camera is supposed to be at the lens of the camera is supposed to be at the glass of the window. So it's physically impossible to get between the lens and the window, or between, the Earth. There's no way, unless you're outside the spacecraft without a, spacesuit on. As you can tell, this is the guy's arm. Here's his hair on his arm. This was an outtake, which they never showed, but we got the unedited tape from it, and it shows that they are, faking the shot. Additionally, and I should have had this queued up too, if you give me a moment, maybe I'll find it, is that we hear this clandestine third party of audio on the tape as well. I'll pause it here and I'll cue it up for you. Here's a clip from A Funny Thing Happened on the Way to the Moon, and this is the shot of allegedly the Earth floating in space. Again, this is really the blackened walls of the spacecraft, and here's a circular window with either the part of the Earth outside of it or a transparency of the Earth over it, and this little crescent piece of cardboard slid in to make it look like night and day. Now, as rudimentary as that may sound, I'm a professional filmmaker, and it was the, inconsistencies of the lighting that made me realize that the film was shot in a TV studio rather than on the surface of the moon. However, this particular shot, the 30 seconds or so of the good takes that they aired to the public, I thought looked extremely convincing. It would have fooled me unless I had received the unedited version of all the behind-the-scenes outtakes. They're also talking about how they're faking the shot. They're talking about how it's going to be used for playback later, even though they claim that the pictures were live. Now, if they're halfway to the moon, and especially this old analog radio equipment, it's going to take about 2 seconds for the radio signal to reach them. They reply in about 2 seconds to go back. So if NASA says, hey, the TV picture looks great, and Neil Armstrong immediately says, hey, glad to hear that, there should be a 4-second delay. So if he responds too soon because he's actually in Earth orbit, only 250 miles above the Earth, then that's going to give away that fact. So he had apparently an earpiece in with a private channel of audio from the CIA or whoever, who counted off on a stopwatch. NASA would ask him a question, 4 seconds would go by, and at the beginning of this tape, they left that third microphone on, and you hear someone say, talk. It's crystal clear from being recorded wherever the tape is being recorded, somewhere at some secret base on Earth. It's not a radio EQ like NASA or like the astronauts. Now, according to NASA, there's only 2 people on this channel of audio, and that's obviously false. Another of my retractors says not only is the footage widely available, which is a lie, because we just showed you a warning at the beginning of the reel saying do not show to the public. This part that I'm about to show you, the audio of the CIA or whoever, they edited out. I mean, if you get Spacecraft's Films version of, showing clips of this, which they had to show to say that it doesn't really mean anything, they edited out the audio of the CIA, which says talk. Now, if that word talk and it being a prompt after a 4-second delay to create the effect that he's further away from the Earth than he really is, and if they deliberately and specifically deleted the evidence of that, that is even greater proof that it proves that they didn't go to the moon. Otherwise, they would have just left the NASA footage as the original, and we would have heard the talk on their version of the film. But you can't hear it because they took it out because they know it's incriminating. And now let's take a look and listen.
Roger, Houston, Apollo 11. Calling in from about 130,000 miles out.
Here, during another segment, also intended to air after...
In fact, I think I have it queued up slightly wrong, although that's a good part of him lying, saying he's 130,000 miles out. This is the part that has the talk in it.
Immediately, Neil Armstrong speaks.
Hello, Apollo 11. Houston, Goldstone says that the TV looks great. Over.
So you can tell there's one party, which is NASA. There's another party, which is Neil Armstrong. And there's another party, which is talk. And again, they're counting off 4 seconds on a stopwatch. He hears them privately in his earpiece. And after he is given the okay to reply to the answer, he then speaks. Because if he replied immediately, which he could have, it would give away the fact that he's, only a couple hundred miles away from the Earth instead of 130,000 miles, as he just claimed. Let's look and listen again.
With the behind-the-scenes trickery to respond. Moments pass, and the oversight is picked up on by the clandestine third party, who quickly prompts them with talk. Immediately, Neil Armstrong speaks.
Hello, Apollo 11. Houston, Goldstone says that the TV looks great. Over.
Now, I had the narrator say, at first I thought that he wasn't paying attention because they're, to NASA because he's doing this fake shot here, and they were reminding him, hey, pay attention. It was after the film was produced that I realized it was a deliberate pause in order to create the effect of an increased radio delay to make it appear as though he were farther from the Earth than he really is. Even here, you can kind of see the extrusion of the window. It's kind of a thickness about, I guess, a couple inches thick, kind of like a window in a ship. They're waterproof, and that's kind of this type of window. There's a thickness to it, and you can actually see the light bouncing off the Earth in Earth orbit, showing the dimension of the window. Then we go basically all the way through. If we've seen how we got the film queued up, we might as well show this last part. Again, here's the part where they claimed was halfway to the moon, and yet this...
If they were the claimed distance...
What happened was, because I've been in the video business a while, they had a manual recorder wherever this was being recorded, a manual videotape recorder. And you hit the stop button. It's one of those older buttons you really had to push all the way down. So they pushed it, and you can see a spark in the video where the electrical connection tried to send the signal, but the manual part did not go through, meaning that this part that they thought was not being recorded was in fact being recorded. They didn't want this setup from the, fake shot of the Earth floating in space to, show the real interior of the spacecraft and the proximity of everything.
And the scene was being changed.
So here basically, they thought this was not being recorded. Again, a moment ago, they said this was the Earth floating in space, right? They said this is the Earth. Here's proof that we're far away from it. Now again, that's a circular window inside of the spacecraft. The camera's actually, 10 feet or so back away, which means they lied. Why would they lie? If they really went to the moon. And there's Michael Collins, I believe, pulling the screen and part of the crescent piece of material to make it look like the Terminator line. And there's a work light. You can see there's diffusion over it to keep it kind of low so it doesn't throw. Now they open the iris, and you see, the real position of the camera and the very bright and near Earth out the window. So basically, all this to tie this in is Van Allen says in these new documents, this is the discovery right here. This is from the Scientific American magazine, March 1959. I guess I told you wrong about the year. And it's basically, tells you that quote. In fact, we can reread that quote if you like. It says right here, this is out of Van Allen's mouth. Remember, Van Allen was the gentleman who discovered the radiation belt. So he is the, absolute expert on it. After he sent probes I think he sent them up in 1958 and the report came out in 1959. He said this: Our measurements show that the maximum radiation level is between 10 and 100 rem per hour. Since a human being exposed for 2 days to even 10 rem would only have a 50% chance of survival, the radiation belts obviously present an obstacle to space flight beyond Earth orbit. Rockets will need to take off from the radiation-free zones at the North and South Pole in order to reach the moon. Now, we know that obviously cannot be done. Here's the effects of what, radiation poisoning looks like. And of course, none of the astronauts ever died, had any burns, had any sickness. None of them even died of cancer. Now, what happened is that the White House, which was turned over from Johnson to Nixon during this time, they said, well, we have to, make it possible to go to the moon. So even though there's this, hard to find document, which we, purchased at an auction and found, what's his name? Von Braun, not Von Braun, sorry. I'm a little tired and sick today. Oops, I'm doing it all wrong here. Can you tell? I haven't slept. There we go. Dr. James Van Allen. So he says the radiation belts are, anywhere from anywhere from 2 to 10 times more than a lethal dose. And yet, when Nixon says, we need you to change that story a little bit, he does. He completely recants on his findings, and they bury, the Geiger counter readings. Unfortunately for him, Geiger counter readings, do not lie. I asked Van Allen's successor, how does he know that the radiation belts are safe or not? And he says, well, proof is that the Apollo astronauts went through it. Now that's what's that called? Circumventing logic there. After Van Allen, now that he's dead, the leading expert on the Van Allen radiation belts, who was like 4 years old when they went to the moon, allegedly, he says he knows for a fact that the radiation belts are not lethal because the Apollo astronauts went through them to the moon and back and did not suffer any ill effects. Now we just have Von Braun saying here that it is absolutely lethal to astronauts. It's 2 to 10 times more than a lethal dose. We have the fact that the space shuttle, when they got 620 miles away from the beginning of the radiation belt, were warned to not get any closer to it and to descend to a lower altitude. And then we have this other information here. We've got, where's this picture? I've got them around here somewhere. Oh, it's the National Science, here it is, National Academy of Sciences. They came out with a Reuters article in 2008 that basically says, in order to, quote, return to the moon, they need to first learn how to protect astronauts from lethal space radiation. And that's pretty interesting, because this is exactly what this gentleman, Kelly Smith, said in 2014, about 6 years later. There's a link to this video. I could have had it queued up, but basically he says, and I'll quote him word for word, he says, the Van Allen belts are dangerous radiation, and we must first learn how to protect the astronauts from the radiation before we can send people through this region of space. When I called up NASA to ask Mr. Smith about his remarks as a journalist, they would not let him talk to any journalists after he made this submission on YouTube as one of their projects of the Orion mission. The Orion mission was unmanned. It went up to 3,600 miles and it did a U-turn and came back. That means the intent of the mission was whatever was at 3,600 miles, which is well into the Van Allen radiation belt. He says they must first learn to protect astronauts from this deadly radiation, or he said dangerous radiation. Van Allen said it was deadly, before they can send astronauts through this region of space. Now, unless the Apollo astronauts had a time machine and went further into the future than we are today, because they said this technology to protect you from the radiation is still yet to be invented, then here's proof right now that the Apollo moon missions did not happen. NASA said so. This new guy who was born after Apollo, he said on camera, on the record, that the technology to protect astronauts from the lethal radiation of the radiation belts has yet to be invented. Then we have James Van Allen himself and these newly discovered papers saying the doses are 2 to 10 times beyond that of a lethal dose. We have the fact that the space shuttle, when it went to its highest altitude ever, they could, detect the radiation as being severe from 620 miles away from it, much less in the middle of it, and they reported that the radiation belts were more dangerous than previously believed. Now, if the Apollo astronauts were in the middle of it 18 times, they should be the experts, right? Not people 620 miles away from it, which is proof they never went through it. All this was going on during the, notorious Nixon administration. Now, Nixon was known, he had a track record of falsification. In fact, there's an event called the Gulf of Tonkin incident. It later came out in I think it's the Senate Committee on Foreign Relations, that the CIA, the NSA, and Defense Secretary Robert McNamara completely staged an attack by North Vietnamese on the United States in order to get people mad at North Vietnam and demand that we, counterattack because, of this offense. In fact, here was a poster from that time. It says, blast them back to the Stone Age because they attacked us first. The fact is, this gentleman, as well as the CIA director and the NSA director, admitted, albeit several decades later, that the entire event, which started the Vietnam War and killed tens of thousands of Americans and maybe 1 million Vietnamese, that event, which got the public interested in the war, was completely contrived. And so here we have, during that same moment in history, Tricky Dick Nixon, and the people are protesting against the war. They had signs like this: "My son was killed in Vietnam, for what?" And so Nixon said the greatest threat to the United States was actually civil unrest about the unpopularity of the Civil War. So what better way to have a pep rally than to have something positive to think about? Now, that's the unique thing about the moon landing conspiracy, is that it's the only conspiracy that I know of that is positive. I mean, whoever killed JFK, he's still dead. Whoever did 9/11, 3,000 people are still dead. But trying to tell somebody that this glorified event that they, pin their, academic credentials on or patriotism on, that it was completely falsified, is like telling them that their team that just won the Super Bowl did so by cheating. They're ready to punch you in the face, which is really interesting. If you think about it, people have differences of opinions all the time. I like this team, I like that team, I like this, political party, I like this one. But why do I receive such hate mail, violent threats, curse words continually for making this movie, simply because I have a different opinion that the moon landings were staged by the CIA? The fact that you get this foaming at the mouth, retaliation against simply a point of view, to me says something doesn't smell right about the event. Now, here we are again, 60 years later. They're saying they can return to the moon in 2030, right? And yet no one has been able to, go back with 60 years greater technology, and yet they did so easily in the 1960s with that antiquated equipment. The way I look at it is, the South Pole is a good example. Just like Lindbergh, 27 to 87, saying that no one was able to repeat the event is absurd. It's the same with the moon landing. Saying they could go to the moon in 1969 in the first attempt, but can't go there until 2029, 60 years later, is absurd. The South Pole, which this is a picture of, has wind speeds, I believe, in excess of 100 miles per hour, and temperatures almost reaching 100 degrees below 0 Fahrenheit. And yet, as you can see, there are bases there. Why are there bases there? Even though it's such a dangerous, deadly place. Because it's physically possible to be there. If it were so easy to go to the moon in the 1960s, there would be bases there by now. The fact that there are not is proof itself that it cannot yet be done. Now here's something that a beloved scientist said, and a friend of a friend told me that he actually, nearing the end of his life, had doubts about the authenticity of the moon landing simply because they could not be repeated. And here's something that he had to say potentially regarding this. One of the saddest lessons of history is this. If we've been bamboozled long enough, that means fooled or deceived, we tend to reject any evidence of the bamboozle. We're no longer interested in finding out the truth. The bamboozle has captured us. It is simply too painful to acknowledge, even to ourselves, that we have been taken. You see that? That he says a sad lesson of history is that if we've been fooled long enough, we're no longer interested in finding out the truth. The lie has captured us because it's too painful to acknowledge, even to ourselves, that we have been taken. Right? All this is about pride. You cannot learn anything new if you're prideful. Pride is the unwillingness to be wrong, just as humility is the willingness to be wrong. And pride blinds you. That's why these people who foam at the mouth and, criticism of death threats and things like that and curse words are blinded, because their pride forbids them from seeing the plain truth that if the moon missions were so easily done in the 60s, they would be bases there by now, and it wouldn't take 60 more years for anyone on Earth to repeat the event. No more than it would take 60 years after Lindbergh flew across the Atlantic for someone to fly across the Atlantic again. By then we had so much more advanced airplanes, and we should likewise have so much more advanced, rockets and spacecraft. If they went to the moon in the 60s, we should have been on Mars 30 years ago. And then here's one last quote from Mark Twain. He said this. He said, "It is easier to fool people than to convince them that they have been fooled." And that's pretty interesting, isn't it? He said it is easier to fool people than to convince them that they have been fooled. That's pretty fascinating, isn't it? I understand that the fascination and marvel with space flight. I used to be fascinated by it by myself. At the same time, as with anything overly adored, the objects of one's infatuation can take advantage of this entranced state of their admirer and feed them, unwittingly, false flattery that is sincerely mistaken as factual. This has been Brother Bart's Conspiracy Corner News, episode 21. Are you prepared for eternity? Please tell your friends, share the link, give me a YouTube thumbs up if you like this video. Check out my new Facebook fan page linked in the description of this video. Like it if you like it, and thank you for your kind support.